Hey friends, welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into one of the strangest corners of the past. A time not too long ago, when ending a marriage did not require a courtroom, but a rope. When a man could take his wife to the local marketplace, wrap a lead around her waist, and, with a quiet nod to the crowd, auction her off to the highest bidder. This was not ancient Rome. Not fiction. This was Victorian England. For nearly a century, wife selling was a public ritual, loud, legal adjacent, and disturbingly ordinary. So tonight, we are not just talking about law or love. We are uncovering how a society could normalize the unthinkable, and how women survived in a world where dignity came second to price. If you enjoy winding down with stories like this, soft, strange, and true, feel free to subscribe. There is always another forgotten tale waiting in the quiet. And while you are here, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? And if there was a moment in this story that caught you off guard, that one detail that made you pause, I would love to know which part it was. Settle in, let the day slip away, and let me tell you a story of broken ropes, whispered resistance, and the long shadow of a practice too strange to forget. This is Boring History for Sleep, and this is the story of how Victorian men sold their wives. Before the sun had fully crested the rooftops of the narrow Victorian streets, the town was already stirring. Chimneys exhaled lazy wisps of smoke, and a few shopkeepers emerged, yawning, to unlatch their shutters. Carts creaked over cobblestones, some pulled by horses, others pushed by hand. The market square lay still, dusted in soft light, as though holding its breath before the bustle began. It could have been any ordinary morning in a sleepy English town. But today, something else was happening. Something that looked, at first glance, oddly familiar, yet deeply unsettling. At the far end of the square, a man walked steadily forward. His clothes were not special, a rough wool coat, muddied boots, a flat cap pulled low. But it was what followed behind him that drew the stares. A rope. Thick and scratchy, knotted tightly in his hand, stretched backward several feet. At the other end of that rope walked a woman. She kept her eyes low, her steps small and careful. Around her neck, the rope tugged slightly with every pace. They were not alone. A few heads turned. One boy pointed. A butcher, elbows deep in flour, muttered something to the baker next door. "Selling her, is he?" The baker shrugged. It would not be the first time. In Victorian England, where laws and customs often moved in opposite directions, scenes like this were not completely unheard of. A husband leading his wife to market, not to shop, but to sell her. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. A public exchange, witnessed by townspeople, sometimes even blessed by cheers. It was not legal, strictly speaking. But it was real. And in some places, it was expected. The walk to market might have been silent. Or it might have been filled with low mutters, or arguments whispered tightly. No two sales were exactly alike. Sometimes the wife cried. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she had agreed to it, and sometimes she had not. What they all shared was the performance, the deliberate theater of the sale. A crowd was part of the ritual. Witnesses gave the event its strange power. The idea that a man could sell his wife like livestock seems impossible now, absurd, cruel, almost cartoonish. But for many Victorian men, this act served as a kind of desperate loophole. Divorce was expensive, slow, and almost unreachable for the working class. If a man wanted to be rid of his wife, or if she wanted to be free of him, what remained was something older than law, public ritual. Imagine standing at the edge of that market square. The smell of onions and fresh bread in the air. The murmur of tradesmen and children. And there, in the center, a woman standing quietly with a rope around her neck. Not screaming. Not running. Just waiting. Waiting for someone to offer a price. These sales took place in town centers, in taverns, in cattle yards, and outside church doors. They were often announced in advance. Some were casual. Others were loud affairs with beer flowing and jokes flying. The wife might be led to a wooden platform. The husband might shout her virtues like an auctioneer. Strong, clean, no debts. Laughter would follow. Or silence. Depending on the crowd, and the woman. To modern ears, it sounds unthinkable. But in the world of Victorian rural England, it carried a logic, warped though it was. If marriage made a woman her husband's property, then property could be transferred. What mattered was not the court's blessing, but the community's nod. If enough people saw it, it became real. There were, of course, layers beneath the surface. Not every wife was dragged unwillingly. Some saw it as their only hope of escape, from abuse, from poverty, from a life they never chose. A new man might offer kindness, or at least something different. In a world that left women with few choices, a rope might offer a strange kind of agency. Still, not all stories were so gray. Many were darker. Wives humiliated before the crowd. Children weeping nearby. Bystanders laughing. The line between ritual and cruelty was thin, and easily crossed. Some men sold their wives spitefully. Others did it drunkenly. A few were violent. And a handful were recorded as unfit to stand trial, after the fact. You might ask, did the police stop this? Did the church? Did someone step in? The answer is complicated. Most authorities turned a blind eye. Courts often considered it a mutual agreement between parties. Clergy spoke little. And when someone did object, it was rarely the woman who was believed. Even in towns where wife selling was known to occur, no one quite agreed on its legality. It was never written into English law. But it was also never clearly punished. Like many customs born in the shadows of the official world, it existed in a strange space between rebellion and tradition. The rope, though crude, held meaning. It mirrored the halter used in livestock markets, a symbol that this woman was now being transferred. To be seen without the rope was to risk the sale being questioned. The symbol mattered as much as the act. It told the crowd, this is not kidnapping. This is ritual. And so they walked, these men and women, through muddy alleys, down cobbled roads, past children playing marbles and old women knitting on benches. A rope between them, a sale ahead of them. No ceremony, no vows. Just price, performance, and public silence. Today, such scenes are nearly forgotten. Photographs do not exist. Only written accounts, dry lines in newspapers, brief mentions in diaries. But the emotional weight of those mornings still echoes. The quiet walk to market was never just a walk. It was a march toward transformation, or degradation, or escape. Or all three. And as we begin this strange and unsettling journey through history, perhaps the most haunting truth is this: they believed it made sense. In the logic of their world, bound by law, class, custom, and control, selling a wife was not madness. It was method. But beneath that method lay centuries of silence. And that is where we begin. In the cold legal framework of Victorian England, marriage was not an agreement between two equals. It was a contract, rigid, one-sided, and reinforced by centuries of law and custom. A man who married acquired not just a companion but control, dominance, and in many ways ownership. A woman, once married, ceased to exist in the eyes of the law as a separate person. She became part of her husband's legal identity, his extension, his dependent, and sometimes, in practice, his property. This was not poetic exaggeration. The law recognized it. Society reinforced it. And the consequences of this were vast, shaping every domestic interaction and echoing across the quiet suffering of millions of women. The legal term was femme covert, literally, a woman, undercover, under the cover of her husband's name, authority, and will. Upon marriage, she could no longer sign contracts, sue or be sued, own or inherit property in her own name. If she had wages, they belonged to him. If she received inheritance, he managed it. If she ran a business, it was effectively his. Her body was not her own in any legal sense. Marital rape, though not even a recognized term then, was not considered possible, for a husband had presumed access. Marriage, in this way, was not simply a bond. It was a legal erasure. To modern ears, this may sound like something from the depths of feudalism. But this system was firmly in place during the so-called Age of Progress, the era of trains and newspapers, industrial factories and steamships. A wife in 1840 might read about the rights of man in a broadside or watch political demonstrations in the streets, yet still be unable to own a bed or keep a coin she earned scrubbing floors. Society may have been modernizing, but its grip on women remained deeply medieval. This understanding of the wife as a dependent, economically, legally, and morally, created a natural, if grim, space for the idea of wife-selling. If a wife was legally absorbed into her husband, if she could be counted among his household assets, then some men came to believe she could also be disposed of like one. Not through formal divorce, which remained painfully complex and reserved for the elite, but through something quicker, simpler, and more visible, a public sale. And though the law never explicitly sanctioned such sales, its silence was deafening. Courts rarely intervened. Police often watched and shrugged. The sale of a wife, performed in public, rope around her neck and coin exchanged, was seen not as a crime, but as a curious tradition. Victorian society operated on a tiered understanding of legitimacy. The elite had access to parliament and legal paperwork. The poor had access only to community customs. In wealthier circles, a marriage could be dissolved through petition, litigation, and scandal. But for laborers and farmhands, miners and tanners, the courtroom was a luxury, distant, expensive, and unfathomably slow. If a man wanted rid of his wife, or if a woman wanted to escape her marriage, there was little to do but stage an exit in plain sight. And so, they walked to the marketplace, not to trade cloth or barley, but to negotiate the ending of a bond the law refused to unbind. The scene itself was part theater, part ritual, part plea. A husband leading his wife by a halter, announcing her value, often drunk or disheveled, speaking to a crowd that watched with curiosity, not outrage. Some wives went willingly. Others did not. Sometimes another man, often already known to the wife, stepped forward and offered a price. The money might be symbolic, a few shillings, a mug of ale, or substantial enough to be called a settlement. What mattered was the performance, the presence of witnesses, and the mutual understanding that once sold, the wife would not return. Underneath this ritual were deeper emotional and social wounds. Women, stripped of all legal selfhood, could neither stay nor leave freely. A cruel husband had total power over money, movement, children. A kind husband still operated within a structure that made kindness optional. And when the structure offered no path out, some women saw the public sale not as humiliation, but as the only available escape. There are records, scarce, fragmented, but real, of women helping to arrange their own sales. Whispered meetings with a suitor. Quiet agreements made before the crowd gathered. For some, being sold was not the worst option. It was a way to step from one cage into another with a slightly larger window. And yet, there is no romance in these transactions. Even where consent existed, it did not blossom from equality. It came from desperation, from the collapse of every other route. A woman's choice to be sold was a choice between two male hands, not between freedom and bondage, but between one kind of captivity and another. Her dignity was bruised in public, her name tied to a spectacle. If she was lucky, the new man treated her with care. If not, she simply became the property of another. The symbolism of the rope, so often mentioned in newspapers and sketches, is telling. It linked the wife to the auction block, to the livestock pen, to the absurd fiction that she was being transferred, in accordance with some great unwritten rule. But that rope also said something more silent and more chilling, that the crowd accepted this. That their gaze, their laughter, or their silence, lent legitimacy to an act no law had blessed. The rope became a contract of performance, and once tightened, few questioned what it truly meant. The Church, often the arbiter of moral judgment in Victorian society, remained oddly mute on the matter. Sermons thundered against drinking, Sabbath breaking, or premarital affection, but rarely, if ever, against wife selling. Perhaps the act was considered too vulgar to mention. Perhaps its public nature made it awkward to address. Or perhaps it struck too close to home, for many churchgoers lived in the same world where men controlled their households by divine decree. To question the sale would be to question the authority that underpinned it. In Parliament, discussions about marriage law remained abstract and philosophical. Legal minds debated whether a married woman could own property, or whether she should have custody of her children, but the daily violence of legal invisibility, the ropes, the sales, the silent departures, rarely made it to the floor. Reform came slowly, often pushed by women's movements and moralists. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in stages beginning in the 1870s, began to carve away at the old laws. But these reforms came late. By the time a wife could truly claim legal personhood, generations had already lived and died beneath the old system. What wife selling reveals, more than anything, is the tremendous gap between law and life, between the statutes written in Westminster and the desperate choices made in muddy lanes and crowded markets. It reveals how tradition, when repeated without challenge, begins to feel like law. And it reveals how silence, legal, moral, communal, can serve as the most powerful endorsement of all. In some cases, the community even encouraged the practice. There are reports of neighbors suggesting the sale, of friends negotiating terms, of publicans offering space behind the tavern for the event. No one saw themselves as cruel. They were, in their minds, solving a problem. Two people unhappy in a marriage had no legal remedy. But they had each other, a rope, and a crowd. That was enough. Women were not unaware of their condition. Letters, diaries, and second-hand reports suggest that many understood the injustice. But without voice, without platform, without even the right to own their own words in court, their resistance remained quiet, and often, tragically, unseen. A wife who refused the sale risked violence. A wife who accepted it might never be seen again. And a wife who remained endured a system that had decided long ago what her worth would be. The story of marriage as property is not just a legal history. It is a story of how power embeds itself into daily life, how it hides behind rituals and customs and gestures so old they seem natural. It is a reminder that what we call normal today may be revealed, tomorrow, as a form of quiet horror. And it is a call to listen, not just to laws, but to the lives shaped by them, twisted around them, and often broken beneath them. Long before the practice of wife-selling became a dark cultural whisper across Victorian England, its roots had already begun winding quietly through the soil of earlier centuries. The first officially recorded cases did not erupt from scandalous headlines or court trials. They appeared almost casually, almost politely, in the margins of old newspapers and journals. Sometimes the mention was no longer than a few lines. Wife sold at market. It might say, price 1 guinea. No outrage. No outrage at all. Just the bare facts of a human being handed from one man to another, as if it were no more remarkable than the price of a sheep. One of the earliest surviving mentions comes from the 17th century. A man named Thomas Hardy, not the author, just a laborer, reportedly led his wife to the marketplace with a rope around her waist. He stood atop a wooden box and called out to the gathering crowd, offering her, sound and body free of vice, with a gentle hand at spinning. The bidding began slowly. A few men laughed. One stepped forward and made an offer. A coin exchanged hands. The crowd clapped. The wife, so the story goes, smiled faintly and walked away with the buyer. No legal challenge followed. It was, apparently, enough that people had seen it happen. By the early 1700s, more examples had begun to circulate. In 1733, a man in Staffordshire sold his wife for £1 and a quart of ale. The event was reported in a regional journal, not as a crime, but as a curiosity. A scene most uncommon, the article noted, yet of no undue character. The lack of outrage is striking, as though the sale of a woman could be peculiar, yes, but not immoral. The tone was bemused, detached, and above all, resigned. These were not isolated cases. They were becoming part of a pattern. Throughout the 18th century, the incidents multiplied. In towns large and small, from Yorkshire to Somerset, men led their wives to market, to the tavern courtyard, to the village square. Always with a rope. Always with witnesses. Sometimes with printed announcements nailed to trees. Wife to be sold. On occasion, these notices listed attributes: age, health, skill with housework. One even advertised, "A woman of fiery temperament, quick to anger, but loyal once settled." Like a livestock sale or a servant's reference, the language was transactional. Humanity, desire, dignity, all vanished behind the grammar of trade. What made these events more than folklore was their sheer consistency. Reports across multiple counties shared the same details: the rope as a symbol of consent, the public nature of the exchange, the price paid, and the presence of a crowd. In many cases, the buyer was not a stranger, but someone known to the wife, a neighbor, a lover, a friend. Occasionally, there were three-way agreements, with the woman included in the negotiation. But this did not redeem the process. The crowd still stared. The price was still counted aloud. The rope still itched against the skin. In 1790, in the small village of Knaresborough, a wife's sale drew such a crowd that the town constable was sent to keep order, not to stop the sale, but to ensure the spectators did not cause a riot. The constable stood calmly by while the husband accepted a bid of 5 guineas. The wife reportedly carried a small bag of her belongings. No one intervened. No court case followed. The sale was completed, and the new husband, though nothing legal had changed, led the woman away down the road. By the early 1800s, local newspapers were printing short blurbs of wife sales with increasing regularity. In 1801, the Times reported, "A man of Wiltshire disposed of his wife at market for 3 shillings and a glass of gin. The woman seemed content with the arrangement." The phrasing is almost cheerful. And this tone, dry, amused, devoid of moral weight, was not unusual. In fact, it was the norm. The press treated these moments not as domestic tragedies but as rural oddities, proof of the curious customs of the lower classes. This casual reporting helped shape public opinion. If journalists did not take the practice seriously, why should anyone else? The wife sales became a kind of grotesque entertainment, the real-life equivalent of a gossip pamphlet. Crowds began to grow. Vendors began to time their stalls around the anticipated events. Children were brought to watch. Some towns even developed reputations as hotspots for the practice. In these places, it was not a shameful act. It was a local tradition, handed down not in law books but in lived experience. One of the most disturbing aspects of this era was the way in which the sales became performative. In Yorkshire, in 1823, a wife's sale was advertised on a placard posted outside a tavern. "Come witness the freedom of a man and the passage of a woman to new care." The phrase, "freedom of a man," is telling. These sales were, at their core, acts of masculine release, the public severing of responsibility, obligation, and affection. The woman became the symbol of that burden. Her sale, her departure, her humiliation, all were woven into the script of male relief. But not every sale was so neat. In 1835, a wife's sale in Kent turned violent when the woman refused to walk with the buyer. A scuffle broke out. She was pulled by force. Bystanders intervened, not to protect her, but to prevent the sale from being disrupted. The man who tried to speak in her defense was beaten by the crowd. When the woman finally relented and followed the buyer down the lane, the gathering resumed its drinks. The newspaper later described the incident as rowdy but resolved. Again, no crime was recorded. There is a temptation to believe these sales were rare, that they were odd events on the fringes of society. But the frequency of their documentation suggests otherwise. The examples are too numerous, too geographically dispersed, too similar in structure to dismiss. They were not common, perhaps, but they were not shocking. That is what makes them horrifying, not the act itself, but the society that watched and said nothing. Some courts, to their credit, did attempt to push back. A few judges denounced wife sales as legally void, declaring them disgusting displays. But these rulings were few, and they came late. By the time the legal system attempted to assert control, The ritual had already embedded itself in rural folklore. Men told stories of father and grandfather doing the same. "It is how things are done," they would say. Tradition defended itself with repetition. In one rare written account from a wife herself, we hear something different. A woman named Margaret, sold in 1848 in a town outside Birmingham, later told a minister that the sale had been arranged in secret. "He said it would be clean and final," she wrote. "I said nothing at first, but he said the new man was kind. I didn't mind leaving, only the rope made me feel less than a dog." Her voice, preserved only in a footnote of a memoir, is a brief glimmer in a story so often told by men. These early cases matter not just because they happened, but because they created a precedent. A silent, unofficial custom, repeated often enough, becomes a kind of shadow law. People begin to believe in its structure, its rules, its language. And over time, the line between the real and the ritual blurs. The crowd forgets it is watching a fiction. The woman forgets she deserves to be heard. The rope tightens. Looking back, it is hard not to wonder how so many people could witness these events and remain unmoved. But that is the nature of systems that devalue human life. They teach you not to see what is in front of you. They teach you that if everyone is watching quietly, it must be all right. That if the woman is not screaming, she must be consenting. That if the price is paid, the deed is done. This is not logic. It is indoctrination. And so the early wife sales set the tone. Not through force of law, but through force of repetition. The more they happened, the more acceptable they seemed. And as we will see in later chapters, this quiet normalizing would lead to far more elaborate, more public, and more ritualized events, until the practice became, for a time, one of the most bizarre and disturbing customs in British history. It was not just a detail. Not just a prop. Not some incidental tool to lead the wife from one end of the market square to the other. The rope, rough, worn, tied around her neck like a halter, was the centerpiece of the entire performance. It was the symbol that made the absurd seem legitimate, the cruel appear procedural, the deeply personal feel somehow official. Without it, the ritual would not work. Without it, the crowd might not know how to respond. The rope gave the wife sale its twisted structure, a silent language understood by all. To the modern mind, the very image is grotesque, a woman, led by the neck, not screaming, not resisting, just moving. But in Victorian England, where symbolism and silence were tools of immense power, the rope served as both a marker and a mask. It told the crowd, this is not a kidnapping, this is not coercion. This is ceremony. This is transfer. This is a tradition old enough that no one quite remembers who first tied the knot. Descriptions of these events across the 18th and 19th centuries return, again and again, to the presence of the rope. It was rarely tied to the wrist or waist. It was almost always looped around the neck, not tight, not choking, but present. Visible. Sometimes clean. Sometimes stained. Its presence transformed the woman from individual into property. And that transformation was necessary to make the ritual appear real. The rope gave the illusion of legality. It made the sale look like a livestock auction. And in a society where marriage itself had reduced a woman's legal existence to shadow, the metaphor was more truth than image. Newspapers, when they covered the sales, rarely failed to mention the rope. It was part of the spectacle. In some cases, illustrations even depicted it, often with exaggerated length and elegance, as though trying to soften the truth behind theatrical distance. The public, so used to seeing animals sold at market, needed the rope to make sense of the scene. Without it, the act would have seemed more violent, more personal. With it, they could pretend it was just another transaction. And yet, for the woman beneath it, the rope was anything but symbolic. It itched. It rubbed. It pulled at the skin when her husband walked too fast or too carelessly. Some women stood still while the rope tugged gently. Others stumbled. In one recorded case, the wife fell and scraped her hands bloody on the cobblestones, and no one stopped to help her up. She was in transfer, the paper said, as though that excused the absence of care. Sometimes the rope was tied in a bow, almost mockingly. Other times it was tied like a noose, not to strangle, but to threaten. The message was clear: you are being sold. You are no longer yourself. You are something to be priced, to be passed along, and this rope is your receipt. If a woman refused to wear it, the sale often would not proceed. The crowd expected the full scene. No rope, no ritual. There were wives who accepted the rope calmly. There were others who wept. A few smiled, either bravely or bitterly, but most said nothing. Silence was the currency of such moments. The rope spoke in place of the woman. It said, "Do not ask her opinion." It said, "This is being done properly." It said, "We are following the rules, even if no law ever wrote them down." And the crowd listened. For the husbands, the rope offered protection. Not from the woman, but from the judgment of others. It distanced the seller from accusations of abandonment or violence. She agreed to it. They could say, "You saw the rope." And in the strange logic of communal consent, the visual was more powerful than any testimony. A woman led by a rope was, somehow, a woman who had agreed to be led. The knot became a substitute for her voice. Some husbands made a show of the rope, twirling it, holding it high, letting it trail behind them. Others kept it short, tight, businesslike. A few held it loosely, allowing the woman to walk beside them instead of behind. Each variation carried a different social signal: confidence, shame, anger, pride. But they all shared one core truth: the rope was not for guidance. It was for performance. What makes the image more painful is that some women came to expect it. In letters and oral histories, a few even mentioned preparing for the sale by choosing better clothes or combing their hair, knowing they would be seen, judged, valued. The rope was the final touch, the costume that made the play possible. A farmer might dust off his boots. A tavern might clear a space. And the woman would stand, with rope around her neck, beneath the gaze of a dozen neighbors. There is no modern comparison that captures this exact blend of spectacle and silence. It was not a legal proceeding. It was not a family matter. It was not quite public punishment. But it borrowed from all three. And at the center of it was always the rope, a physical thing doing the work of unspoken laws, societal scripts, and gendered control. It was not tight enough to strangle, but just tight enough to shame. Even children noticed it. In one account from a village near Norwich, a young boy who watched a wife's sale later told his grandmother, "She walked like she was tired, but the rope wouldn't let her stop." That child saw more than most adults allowed themselves to see. He saw the rope not just as a symbol, but as a restraint, emotional, social, physical. And it was. In later years, as reformers began to challenge the practice, the rope became one of their chief arguments. How could any civilized society allow its women to be led like animals? Editorials called it degrading. Clerics began to mutter against it. And yet, in some towns, the practice continued, not because people believed it was just, but because they had grown used to it. The rope had become tradition. And tradition, when old enough, begins to resemble truth. Some husbands insisted the rope was not meant to humiliate. "It's just what you do," one man reportedly said in 1852. "It shows she's leaving." But that was the point. It did show she was leaving. And it showed how little her leaving belonged to her. The rope made the departure not hers, but his. She left when he led her, and stopped when he stopped. She was no longer a wife. She was cargo. A few buyers, to their credit, cut the rope immediately after the purchase. "You're free now," they would say, theatrically or sincerely. But freedom, in these moments, was not a gift they could grant. It was an illusion. A woman bought was still beholden to the man who bought her, to the town that watched, to the memory of the sale. The rope might be gone, but the knot it left behind remained. The rope also served as a chilling equalizer. Whether the wife was young or old, kind or angry, loved or unloved, the rope erased those details. It made all women uniform, equally silent, equally for sale, equally invisible beneath the rules of the act. It reminded everyone watching that this could happen to any woman. And it reminded every woman that she had no true escape, only transfer. There are no ropes preserved in museums. No examples wrapped in glass with neat placards describing their use. The artifacts of this ritual were too ordinary, too humiliating, too easily discarded. What remains instead are sketches, accounts, and echoes. But those echoes are loud. They tell us that the rope was not just part of the scene, it was the scene. It was the proof that something shameful was being done, and that no one was going to stop it. In today's world, we often say that symbols have power. But in Victorian wife sales, it was not just the rope's symbolism that mattered, it was its touch. The roughness against the throat. The tug on the windpipe when stepping too slowly. The heat of it under a summer sun, or the cold bite of it on a frosty morning. It was not metaphor. It was real. And perhaps that is what makes the rope so hard to forget. Not because it was dramatic, or strange, or cinematic, but because it was simple. So simple, in fact, that no one thought to question it. And when cruelty becomes that simple, it becomes nearly impossible to see, until it is too late. It is easy to imagine a wife's sale as a private, desperate moment. A quiet farewell in a dim corner of the world. But that is not what it was. The reality, more often than not, unfolded in the open, a performance laid bare beneath the midday sun or the murky glow of a tavern lantern. It happened where people gathered, in the heart of the village, amid the echoes of gossip, bartering, and footfall. The marketplace was not just a backdrop. It was the stage. And the sale of a wife was a scene performed not in shameful secrecy but in full, deliberate view. Victorian marketplaces were the pulse points of public life. There you would find fresh produce, salted meats, copper tools, cheap lace, tobacco, animals, gossip, rumors, and noise. Everyone passed through, farmers, maids, clergy, drunkards, widows, children. To stage a wife sale in such a space was no accident. It was strategic. The visibility made it feel legitimate. It allowed the seller to signal his intent. And it offered an audience, without which the ritual would lose much of its weight. For a sale to be valid, it had to be seen. And seen it was. Accounts from the late 18th and early 19th centuries describe these scenes in unnerving detail. The husband would arrive early, perhaps a little nervous, perhaps entirely calm. Sometimes he would shout a few words to gather attention. Sometimes the rope was enough. A crowd would form, quickly, easily, instinctively. They knew what this was. And they came not to stop it, not even to question it, but to observe. Observing made it feel like tradition. Like law. Like something more real than silence. The crowd served many purposes. It acted as a witness, lending the exchange a kind of ritualized consent. It provided a buffer of anonymity. In a crowd, no one individual had to bear moral responsibility for the moment. It transformed private sorrow into public entertainment. And it helped enforce the rules, unwritten as they were. If a wife's sale did not unfold properly, the crowd might jeer. If the husband failed to speak clearly, or if the rope was missing, someone might call out, "Where's the halter? What's she worth?" The crowd policed the performance, even as it claimed to be passive. Vendors sometimes paused their business to watch. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Laughter was not uncommon. Nor were jokes. "I'll give you 2 pigs for her," someone might shout. "What's her temper like?" another might ask. The cruelty was casual, woven into the fabric of everyday humor. And in this environment, the woman stood. Silent. Roped. On display. She was not just being transferred, she was being measured by strangers, laughed at, or pitted, depending on her age, her dress, her face. In some towns, wife sales became semi-regular events, not frequent, but expected. Locals might say, "They are selling one next Tuesday." The tavern might prepare for the crowd. There are even stories of sales timed to coincide with market fairs, when out-of-town visitors would be present. The larger the crowd, the more official the sale seemed. Some husbands even printed small handbills, like auction notices. Others simply relied on word of mouth. But no matter the method, the marketplace was always central. Taverns and alehouses were often secondary stages. If the marketplace was too crowded, or the weather poor, the transaction might move inside. Back rooms, courtyards, or even the bar counter became sites of exchange. Here, drink flowed more freely, and the mood was sometimes darker. Some wives were already drunk when they arrived, not by choice, but by force. Others were given gin to dull their resistance. The rope would still be present, even indoors. Sometimes tied to a chair. Sometimes held like a leash. In these spaces, the transaction took on the flavor of a wager. Men drinking heavily might joke about bidding. Fights could break out. Once, in 1843, a man in Gloucestershire reportedly tried to outbid another with a pocket watch instead of coin. The husband considered it. The wife said nothing. A scuffle ensued, and the constable arrived only to ensure no windows were broken. The sale still went through. The crowd cheered, then returned to their tankards. In the tavern, as in the market, the act was both spectacle and release. What made the spectacle so powerful was its illusion of order. There was a sequence: arrival, announcement, presentation, bidding, and transfer. It mirrored the structure of livestock markets. And this illusion created a kind of comfort for the onlookers. They were not witnessing cruelty, they told themselves. They were witnessing process. A flawed but accepted way of resolving domestic tensions. Better than murder, some would say. At least he is not beating her. The spectacle trained people to see this as solution, not failure. Women were not always passive in this. Some participated deliberately. They might whisper to a lover to be present. They might dress modestly, to attract less attention, or flamboyantly, to increase their perceived worth. A few reportedly smiled as they were sold, though we cannot know whether the smile was relief, defiance, or resignation. But even when consent was present, power was not. The marketplace spectacle was never hers. It belonged to the crowd, to the seller, to the performance itself. Some towns attempted to regulate the practice. Local officials asked for it to be moved away from the main square, or suggested quiet locations. But these efforts rarely succeeded. The spectacle was the point. A wife's sale in an alley held no weight. It had to be seen to feel real. The crowd was the court. The market was the judge. And the rope, that ever-present rope, was the law. In one particularly well-documented case from 1837, the sale was staged near a cathedral. The irony was lost on few. As the bells rang for afternoon service, a man led his wife before a small crowd and offered her to a good man with honest pockets. The crowd chuckled. A coin exchanged hands. The woman walked away with another man. Later that day, the preacher delivered a sermon on Christian duty. No mention was made of what had occurred outside the gates. These public sales also affected the next generation. Children who watched them absorbed the ritual. Young boys learned that women could be discarded. Young girls learned that marriage could be revoked, not by law, but by spectacle. The lesson was not just that wife selling was possible. The lesson was that the community approved. And so the cycle continued, wrapped in normalcy. The marketplace spectacle also hardened the boundaries of class. These sales rarely happened among the elite. Wealthier families had lawyers, letters, and legal divorces. But for the poor, the marketplace became a courtroom. And that courtroom favored the seller, not the wife. The spectacle disguised poverty as choice, injustice as ceremony. And it offered the illusion of autonomy in a world that provided almost none. Occasionally, someone tried to object. A traveler unfamiliar with local customs might voice concern. A new vicar might frown. But such objections were usually drowned by laughter, dismissal, or mockery. City folk do not understand our ways, they would say. Let them talk. And the performance would continue, as it had for decades. Photographs do not exist of these moments. They happened before cameras were common, and perhaps no one would have thought to capture them anyway. But written descriptions remain, in journals, newspaper clippings, letters. And they paint a picture not of horror, but of routine. That is the real horror. That these moments were ordinary. Expected. Watched without protest. Remembered with shrugs. And so, the marketplace spectacle persisted. It did not need approval. It needed only a rope, a woman, a crowd, and a man willing to play the part. The setting did the rest. The cobblestones remembered each footstep. The walls echoed with the same call. Wife for sale! And history, for far too long, did not look away. If there is one detail that stings with quiet cruelty in the wife-selling tradition, it is this: the price. Not the rope, not the public shame, not even the act itself, but the number. The simplicity of a sum. The way a lifetime of memories, labors, sacrifices, and soft smiles could be measured in coins. A shilling. A pint of beer. A few pieces of silver. It was not just dehumanizing. It was brutally casual, as though setting a price on a woman was as natural as weighing a sack of potatoes or measuring oats by the scoop. Prices varied from town to town, year to year, marriage to marriage. Some women were sold for a few pence, others for several guineas. There are even accounts of wives exchanged for items: a dog, a donkey, a few barrels of ale. It might seem absurd, even fictional, but the ledgers of the past do not lie. In one record from 1839, a wife was sold for £2 and a dinner. The dinner was specified: mutton with carrots. That was the cost of freedom, or exile, depending on how one chose to view it. The bidding process, when it happened at all, was rarely formal. This was no auction house. There was no wooden gavel, no numbered paddles, no velvet gloves. But there was still a crowd, and the crowd understood its role. A few men might call out their offers, sometimes sarcastically, sometimes sincerely. "A crown and a bottle! 3 shillings and no complaints!" The husband would weigh the options, often pretending to deliberate. In some cases he accepted the first offer. In others he waited for more. It was not about the money. It was about the moment. For some, the bid was a test of pride. A man might refuse a low offer, not out of love for his wife, but out of fear that accepting too little would shame him. "She's worth more than that," he might say, even if he had already made up his mind to be rid of her. The price became a reflection not of her value, but of his own ego. And in this strange equation, the woman had no voice at all. She was not asked what she thought. She was the object that proved or diminished her husband's pride. In other cases, there was no bid at all, just a fixed price. "She's yours for a crown." A simple line, spoken plainly. A hand extended. A coin exchanged. And the matter, as far as the crowd was concerned, was done. Sometimes the buyer paid in goods: a cart of firewood, a lamb, a length of cloth. These were not symbolic payments. They were real, tangible, transactional. The woman, standing by, was the only one without anything to trade. Newspapers recorded these prices with eerie neutrality. "A wife was sold for 2 shillings and 6 at the fair today." That is all. No editorial, no commentary. Just the cost. And for the readers of the time, these blurbs became a kind of social scorecard, evidence of rural life's peculiar customs. Few questioned the ethics of it. Fewer still asked what became of the woman after the coins changed hands. Some historians argue that low prices indicate a lack of seriousness, that these were farces, not real transfers. But that assumption underestimates the economy of desperation. For a poor man in the 1800s, even a few coins could stretch into a week of food or firewood. More importantly, the money was less about gain than about punctuation. It closed the sentence. It ended the chapter. A price, however small, made the sale real in the eyes of the crowd. In rare instances, a wife fetched a higher sum, £5, £10, sometimes more. These were not aristocratic women, but rather those seen as especially valuable for labor or virtue. One woman, described in a Wiltshire paper as robust and clever with animals, was sold for £7 and a calf. The buyer reportedly smiled as he paid. The crowd applauded. The husband disappeared into a nearby inn. Whether the woman felt chosen or sold, no one recorded. Bartering added another layer of distance between the act and its implications. A pig, for example, feels less shameful than a coin. A bundle of wool seems less damning than silver. But this, too, is illusion. In the end, the transaction was the same, a person exchanged for a thing. It did not matter if it jingled in a pouch or oinked in a pen. The woman was still the object. There are moments, buried in accounts and memoirs, where women themselves mention the price. One, writing years later, said, "I asked him what I was worth to the man. He said 3.5, same as a kettle. I do not remember if he meant pounds or shillings. I remember the kettle." Her words, simple and devastating, stripped the ritual of its distance. Behind every price was a memory, and behind every memory, a wound. Not all prices were paid immediately. In some cases, the buyer promised to pay later, or offered work in return. This created even more ambiguity. If the payment was never made, was the sale invalid? If the wife left anyway, what did that make her? An escapee? A free woman? A dead? The Victorian legal system had no clear answer. And so, as always, the crowd answered instead. If they saw the rope and the handoff, it was real. Whether money followed was irrelevant. Some towns developed price expectations. In one district, a wife of good health was, normally, sold for £1. In another, younger wives commanded more, especially if they had no children. Age, fertility, demeanor, and labor skill all became unspoken metrics. The sale mirrored the cold logic of livestock pricing. And yet the crowd did not blink. They had seen it before. They would see it again. Bidders came from all walks of life. Neighbors, strangers, old lovers, opportunists. Some came with genuine intent to rescue or reunite. Others came with darker motives, control, revenge, or cruelty. The price rarely revealed the buyer's purpose. A kind man might offer a penny. A brute might offer £10. The coin told no truth. Only time would. Children sometimes watched these sales. Boys might cheer when bids were called. Girls might stare, silent and wide-eyed. What did they learn from this theater? That women were negotiable. That worth could be counted. That marriages could be ended with a handshake and a coin. These lessons echoed into future generations, long after the coins had been spent. The ritual of bidding gave the sale its drama. It made it feel alive, unpredictable. But it also disguised the pain beneath theater. Each coin flipped, each price shouted, was a tiny erasure. A chiseled tap against the dignity of the woman in question. And once the final price was agreed upon, there was no ceremony. No contract. Just movement. The husband handed the rope to the buyer. The buyer took it. The wife walked away. And the crowd turned back to their bread and their beer. In retrospect, it is tempting to believe that the low prices prove the act's unseriousness. But this is a mistake. The price does not diminish the act, it reveals it. The cheaper the cost, the clearer the message, that the woman's value, in the eyes of the system that enabled her sale, was never more than token. She was worth what a man was willing to take to be rid of her, and what another was willing to pay to possess her. There are no receipts from these sales. No ledgers or contracts. But the prices live on in newspaper columns, in whispered anecdotes, in the stunned silence of modern readers. They remind us that behind every shocking tradition lies a deeper truth, that cruelty, when normalized, rarely needs a high cost. Sometimes it hides behind small change. And so, in village after village, the bids were called, the coins clinked, and the women walked away, not richer, not freer, just exchanged. Their names forgotten, their worth debated, their footsteps swallowed by the market dust. A price had been paid. And history, quiet and complicit, continued on. It is perhaps the most haunting question of all. How did this happen in plain sight? How could men lead their wives to market, tie ropes around their necks, and sell them like livestock, and no one stopped it? No sheriff, no magistrate, no official voice of order. The answer, as unsettling as the act itself, lies not in written laws, but in the thick, invisible fog of legal silence. Wife selling persisted not because it was legal, but because, astonishingly, it was not clearly illegal. Victorian England was not a land of chaos. There were courts, statutes, judges, juries. Property law was detailed. Contracts were enforceable. Marriage was, at least on paper, a sacred legal bond. And yet, nowhere in that sea of ink did the law address what a man could do when he no longer wanted his wife. Divorce, for most, was simply not an option. It was expensive, rare, and socially ruinous. For the poor, it was as unattainable as owning land or voting in Parliament. The law did not help the husband who wished to be rid of his wife. So, in that absence, custom stepped in. Wife selling was not codified. No statute ever declared it valid. But no law clearly forbade it either. It existed in a strange gray zone, tolerated, overlooked, and at times quietly acknowledged by local authorities. And that silence gave it power. When a husband led his wife to market, he was not breaking a rule, he was bypassing a system. And as long as no one challenged him, the illusion of legitimacy remained intact. Local officials often turned a blind eye. Constables shrugged. Magistrates refused to intervene. Some even joked about it. In the eyes of many, the act was beneath their concern, a poor man's drama, hardly worth a courtroom's time. If they both agreed to it, they would say, "Then what harm?" And in that shrug, tradition took root. Inaction became tacit permission. There are accounts of constables being present during wife sales, standing silently as the rope was passed from one man to another. Sometimes they even helped keep the peace, ensuring the crowd did not grow unruly. Their presence, passive though it was, added an air of order to the ritual. If the lawman did not object, surely the act could not be wrong. This was how communities processed the moment. They took silence as consent. Occasionally, a sale did draw legal attention, but only if it caused a disturbance. If two men fought over the same wife, or if the crowd grew violent, the seller might be fined for breach of the peace, but not for the sale itself. The act was never on trial, only the noise it made. This distinction is crucial. It reveals how deeply the system had adapted to the practice, without ever legitimizing it. The courts, when asked, often dodged the issue. In one famous case from 1832, a man who had purchased a woman refused to return her to her former husband. The husband brought the matter to court, demanding restitution. The judge, rather than rule on the legality of the sale, simply dismissed the case, stating, "No law recognizes such a contract." And yet, he did not penalize either man. The woman's fate remained unresolved. The sale stood, in practice if not in law. This legal ambiguity created a loophole large enough to walk through, with a rope and a crowd. And so, for decades, that is what people did. They acted out the sale not because it was endorsed by Parliament, but because it was allowed by silence. In the absence of prohibition, the ritual thrived. Part of the problem lay in the nature of marriage itself under Victorian law. A wife, legally speaking, became one with her husband upon marriage. Her property became his. Her legal identity was absorbed into his. She could not sign contracts, own land, or sue in her own name. This legal fusion meant that if a man no longer wanted his wife, and she agreed to be passed on, the courts often saw no reason to interfere. It was, in their eyes, a private matter between a man and his property. There were reformers, of course, writers, preachers, and a few brave politicians who decried the practice. They called it barbaric, demeaning, a stain on the moral fabric of the nation. But they were few, and their voices were often drowned out by the laughter of the crowd and the indifference of officials. Change, when it came, did not come from outrage. It came from slow erosion, from a shifting sense of shame. The newspapers played a strange role. By reporting on the sales, usually in small, uncritical snippets, they preserved the practice in public memory without challenging its legitimacy. Readers treated the articles as oddities, curiosities. "Look what they do in Norfolk," one might say. "Savage folk." But the practice was not regional. It happened everywhere. The law's silence was national. The law also struggled with the question of consent. If the wife did not protest, or appeared to go willingly, courts were less likely to intervene. But what did consent look like in such circumstances? Was silence agreement? Was a rope around the neck evidence of cooperation? The courts did not ask. They did not want to know. And so, they allowed the question to remain unanswered. Some buyers sought written agreements. Simple notes stating that the wife was given over to them. These scraps of paper, signed with shaky hands or marked with an X, held no legal weight. But they added another layer of ritual. They made the sale feel documented. And in a world where official divorce was impossible for most, such tokens became their own form of legality. Clergy, too, often avoided involvement. Church doctrine held marriage as sacred, indissoluble. But wife selling happened outside the church's reach, in markets, not pews. And so the church looked away. A few ministers spoke against it, but most did not. After all, what could they do? Deny communion? Refuse burial? The law did not act. Why should they? It is tempting to imagine that this legal neglect was an oversight, a blind spot. But that gives the system too much innocence. In truth, the silence was deliberate. Authorities knew wife selling was happening. They chose not to prosecute. Not because they approved, but because they believed enforcement would create more problems than it solved. Better to let it die out on its own. Better to let the poor police themselves. And eventually it did die out, slowly, unevenly. By the late 1800s, the practice had become rarer, more frowned upon. Legal reforms around marriage, property, and women's rights chipped away at the culture that had made wife selling seem like an option. But it never ended with a bang. No law was passed declaring, "This shall cease." It simply faded, like smoke after a fire. Even so, the legal record remained stained with silence. No law was broken, and yet something was lost: dignity, autonomy, trust. The courts may not have sanctioned wife selling, but by refusing to stop it, they became part of it. Complicity by silence is still complicity. And history remembers what the law tried to ignore. In the end, the law's failure was not in its absence of words, but in its absence of care. It saw the rope, the woman, the coin, and said nothing. It watched a performance, and chose not to call it cruelty. And in doing so, it became the quietest actor of all. History has long made a habit of listening to men and recording their steps: the buyer, the seller, the drunk in the tavern, the constable who looked away. But the woman at the center of the wife's sale? Her voice is barely a whisper in the surviving pages. She is almost always described, but almost never quoted. Writers noted the color of her shawl, the tired droop of her eyes, the way she walked behind her husband with a rope tied loosely at her neck. But rarely did they ask what she thought. And when they did, her answer was not recorded. Still, if we look carefully through letters, diaries, and the hidden lines between printed words, fragments of her perspective begin to flicker into view. Some women agreed to the sale. Not joyfully, but willingly, or at least, without protest. In these rare accounts, the wife's sale was not just her husband's escape, but her own. A way out of a bad match, a loveless home, or an abusive man. For her, being sold might have been the only open door, however cruelly framed. In such cases, she may have chosen her new partner ahead of time. She may have rehearsed the transaction, even negotiated terms. Some were said to have smiled faintly during the transfer, or looked the buyer in the eye. It was not power, not truly, but it was a sliver of agency, carved out of desperation. Yet far more often, she remained silent. Not out of agreement, but because no one asked her to speak. She was brought along like an object, her fate already decided by the man holding the rope. She may have known what was happening, or she may have learned only upon arrival. The marketplace crowd would have watched her carefully, looking for signs of emotion. But what could she show? If she cried, she might be mocked. If she resisted, she might be dragged. If she stood still, people assumed she accepted her fate. Silence was not consent. It was often all she had left. In one diary entry from 1847, a female observer noted the look on a wife's face during a sale in Leeds. She did not blink. She did not flinch. Her eyes were wide but flat, like someone listening from very far away. That quiet observation, buried in the margins of an old journal, is one of the few true glimpses into the inner world of a souled wife. Her fear, her numbness, her distance, not staged, not symbolic, but terribly real. Some wives resisted, not with words, but with subtle acts of defiance. A turn of the shoulder. A refusal to walk. A tightening of the jaw. A few even tried to run, though rarely succeeded. Accounts mention sellers tightening their grip or shouting commands. There are reports of bystanders laughing as women tried to untie the rope. These moments, when recorded, were almost always framed as comedy, the way a stubborn mare might behave at auction. The woman's resistance was rarely honored. It was rewritten as entertainment. There were also women who, after the sale, found themselves in better circumstances. This is a difficult truth, but one that cannot be ignored. Some buyers were gentler, more respectful, more stable than the husbands who sold them. In these few cases, the wife's sale was not an end, but a strange beginning, a shift from misery to something close to peace. These stories are rare and complex. They do not redeem the act. But they remind us that within even the most unjust rituals, human outcomes vary. Still, for every tale of mild relief, there were many more of humiliation. Public sales stripped women of dignity before their neighbors, their children, and themselves. Even if no one jeered, the weight of being stared at, measured, priced, and handed off could not be softened by circumstance. Some never recovered. In one local memoir, an old woman recalled seeing her mother sold when she was 8 years old. She never looked us in the eye again after that, the daughter wrote. It was as if part of her face had closed. The shame did not always come immediately. Some women, especially those in tightly knit villages, found themselves ostracized afterward. Even if they had been sold against their will, the stain of the sale clung to them. People whispered. Friends avoided their doorstep. Other women turned away. Ironically, while the seller often returned to public life unscathed, the sold wife bore the social punishment. She had been tainted by public transaction, and that stain, though invisible, was hard to scrub away. One might imagine that, once sold, the woman had a chance to start over, to build a new life, to claim freedom. But that rarely happened. The new man might treat her more kindly, or he might not. Either way, she was still under male authority. She had not gained autonomy, she had only been transferred. Her thoughts, her hopes, her grief, they remained invisible in the eyes of the law, and often in the eyes of the community. There are isolated reports of women who spoke out after being sold. In court records, some filed complaints, not about the sale itself, but about the man who bought them. Abuse, abandonment, neglect. These complaints were often dismissed. You went with him willingly, the magistrate might say. Whether she did or not was rarely investigated. The sale, though not legal, carried a shadow of social legitimacy that made her protest seem hollow in the court's ears. There were also women who wrote poems. Anonymous ones, published in small local papers or scratched in margins of old books. One fragment survives from a woman in Derbyshire. They led me past the fruit stalls where apples gleamed like tears and I walked like I was waking from a marriage made of fears. These verses are raw, uncertain in their grammar, but rich in pain. They remind us that, though their voices were muffled, they were not entirely lost. Others internalized the sale, blaming themselves. I must not have been good. One woman is quoted saying to her sister, else he would have kept me. This kind of emotional fallout, the quiet reshaping of self-worth, is among the most painful legacies. The sale was not just a public act. It was a private wound, carved into the soft architecture of a woman's identity. For some women, the sale was a form of erasure, a way of disappearing from a life they never chose. But erasure is not freedom. It is just a quieter prison. Many went on to live lives of silence, poverty, or repetition, married again, but not free. They bore children, cooked meals, stitched shirts, and never once spoke of the day they were led through the market like a thing. And what of the women who were never sold, but lived with the fear that they might be? For every sale that took place, there were many more marriages where the threat hung in the air like smoke. If you do not behave, I will take you to market. It became a cruel joke, a household whisper, a warning. And so even those not sold lived in the shadow of the act. Over time, as wife-selling became rarer, some women began to speak of it with more clarity. In memoirs written decades later, they recalled the practice with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. I watched one when I was a girl. One woman wrote in 1902. And I thought, that could be me. It never left me. Not even in my old age. The trauma, like the ritual, was inherited. The true tragedy is that we cannot know what most of them thought. Their stories were not recorded. Their feelings were not deemed relevant. They were the center of the sale, yet absent from the record. We must reconstruct their voices from silence, from reactions, from hints left behind. It is not perfect. But it is necessary. Because without their voices, we risk turning wife-selling into abstraction, a strange factoid from the past, rather than a lived horror. These women were real. They breathed, feared, dreamed, and hurt. And though they left few words, they left behind a legacy of quiet resilience, and a question that still haunts: how many more stories were never told? In every account of a wife's sale, there is an unspoken presence, the child. Standing just outside the action, watching with wide eyes or huddling behind someone's legs, trying to understand what none of it meant, and yet somehow feeling what all of it implied. The wife's sale was not a secret. It happened in public spaces, the market square, the tavern yard, the open street. It happened at midday, when the sun was high and the town was awake. And when a community watches, the children are never far behind. They may not have understood the words. The bidding, the laughter, the final exchange, much of it would have floated over their heads like a language not yet learned. But they saw the rope. They saw the woman's face. They saw their father let go and another man take hold. And that was enough. Enough to leave a mark. Enough to start a question that might never find an answer. Sometimes the children were not just onlookers. Sometimes they were participants. If the sold wife was their mother, and she often was, they stood at her side or behind her legs, confused by the gathering crowd. They clung to her skirts. They looked up at the man they called father, and wondered why he was stepping away. If she cried, they cried. If she was silent, they grew quiet too. They did not yet have the words for abandonment, shame, or legal void. But they had the feeling. The tight knot in the stomach. The fear of being left. There are accounts, scattered in the edges of memoirs, of children pulled from their mother's arms at the moment of sale. The father declaring, "The children stay with me," or, "He only wants her, not them." And the rope would be handed off, but the child would remain, or vice versa. These decisions were made casually, almost cruelly, like moving furniture or dividing bread. There was no paperwork, no custody hearing, only male voices deciding fates. Other times, the new man accepted the child as part of the price, not out of compassion, but obligation. "I suppose he comes too," a buyer might say, nodding toward the boy. And the mother would grip her son's hand tightly, as if that rope now stretched between them instead. They walked away together, but not as a family. As parts of a bargain. It is hard to imagine the confusion that bloomed in a child's chest on such a day. The marketplace smells, fresh bread, dung, pipe smoke, mingling with the tension in the air. The crowd not angry, just amused or indifferent. Their mother's face strained but silent. Their father joking with a friend nearby, or already turning to go. Some children stood frozen. Others screamed. And some simply stood still, because what else could they do? Teachers would sometimes note changes after a sale. A boy quieter than usual. A girl who no longer played. In rural schools, where discipline was strict and emotional life was kept beneath the surface, such things were rarely discussed. But the sale's echo followed the child. whispers in the village. Cruel jests from older boys. Your mum got haltered, they would say. Did she come with a saddle? Even when the child did not witness the act itself, they felt its aftermath. A mother gone. A new man in her place. A silence between adults that pulsed with shame. Some were told she had gone to the city, or found work in the next parish. But lies, however kindly meant, could not dull the feeling of being untethered. And in small communities, truths had a way of circling back. There were children who, upon growing older, wrote down their memories. Not many, but enough. One man, recalling his boyhood in Lancashire, wrote, "She was there one day, then not the next. My father said he'd sold her. I asked for how much? He said £1, and good riddance. I do not remember my mother's voice. Just the rope." Some children blamed themselves. They imagined they had done something to cause the rift. A misbehavior, a spilled bucket, a late return home. Children are always eager to find reasons, even if those reasons do not make sense. And in the absence of clear answers, they turned inward. The sale became not just a loss, but a secret shame, folded and kept like a broken toy. And what of the children of the buyer? How did they view the new woman, the one led in by rope, the one whom their father now called wife? Did they accept her? Fear her? Resent her? That story, too, remains largely untold. The fusion of families through transaction rarely created warmth. It created distance. A sense that relationships were conditional, fragile for a sale. The trauma of these events did not vanish with time. It lingered. It followed the children into adulthood. It shaped their views of marriage, of power, of safety. Some grew to repeat the cycle, treating women as things to be managed or exchanged. Others became fiercely protective, determined to live differently, to forget the square and the rope and the laughter of that day. But forgetting is not the same as healing. Girls who watched their mothers sold grew up with a shadow around love. Could it be trusted? Could it last? Could it vanish with a coin? They married with caution or avoided marriage altogether. Or they entered it with the quiet dread that they, too, might one day be priced. And boys, especially, absorbed the lesson of ownership. Even if no one said the words aloud, the message was clear. A man could end his union, reshape his household, replace his wife, all without law or blessing. Just a rope. Just a crowd. Just a price. It gave them a sense of power, distorted and dangerous. Not all children were harmed irreparably. Some, especially those rescued from abusive homes by the transaction, found peace. A new man, a gentler stepfather, a mother no longer living in fear. These stories are real, and they matter. But they do not erase the many more tales of confusion, sorrow, and broken trust. What history often forgets is that a wife's sale was not a moment. It was a lifetime folded into one sharp public scene, and that lifetime included the children. Their minds recorded it, even when their mouths stayed shut. Their world shifted, even if the market square went back to normal by the afternoon. To this day, the echoes of those scenes remain hidden in dusty ledgers, old family stories, and the emotional DNA passed down from generation to generation. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: they watched, and no one thought to shield their eyes. Because in that world, the sale was not scandal. It was spectacle. If the sale of a wife was only about separation, a simple severing of one bond and the forming of another, it might have happened behind doors, quietly, with shame. But that was never the shape it took. Wife selling in Victorian England was not only a transaction, it was a ritual. A performance. It was not hidden. It was acted out, rehearsed, repeated, dramatized, until even its cruelty wore a familiar face. Like a play whose script everyone knew by heart, even if no one quite believed the story anymore. The stage was usually a public space, a village market, a fairground, the steps of a town hall, even a tavern's muddy yard. It had to be seen. Without an audience, the ritual lost its power. The community, by watching, gave the act a kind of legitimacy. The onlookers were not merely spectators. They were witnesses. Their presence, their silence or laughter, was part of the script. They made it feel real. The rope was almost always present, often tied around the woman's waist, sometimes around her neck. It was not a necessity. The man could have walked beside her. But the rope had symbolism. It suggested property, control, livestock. It marked her as being transferred, not leaving. And though its practical purpose was small, its psychological weight was enormous. Without the rope, the crowd might see a departure. With the rope, they saw a sale. Many sales began with a declaration. The husband would raise his voice and announce the terms. "This woman, my wife, I offer for sale." He might list her qualities. Good cook, sound of health, obedient when she wishes to be. He might mention her flaws. Quarrelsome, prone to gossip, dislikes the washing. This was not out of transparency. It was theater. It was part of the ritual, just as a market crier might exaggerate the virtues of an old mule to stir a laugh or tempt a bid. Sometimes, mock bidding followed. The crowd, lubricated by drink or habit, would shout out numbers. Some meant nothing by it. Others were serious. One man might offer a crown. Another might raise it to a shilling and a beer. The husband, now part performer, would weigh the bids. He might pretend to hesitate, to look to his wife, to ask the crowd if they thought the price fair. It was absurd. It was tragic. But it was routine. In a strange and unsettling way, the ritual gave the illusion of order. It turned chaos into something structured. A man losing a wife and a woman losing her home became, instead, a moment of village theater. The familiarity of the process soothed the community, and in doing so, made the violence of it less visible. The rope, the bidding, the final handshake, these were not legal formalities. They were emotional camouflage. When the final bid was accepted, a hand would be shaken. Sometimes, a coin exchanged. Sometimes, an agreement made over ale. The rope would be handed from one man to another, and the woman would follow. This act, the physical transfer of the rope, was the climax of the ritual. It marked the shift. It gave the crowd closure. The sale was done. There are reports of cheers, of clapping, of laughter. The crowd treated it like conclusion, the curtain falling. Rarely did they linger on what came next. The wife walked away, often silently. The husband might disappear into the tavern or back to his home, alone or lighter. The buyer might walk off with the woman, sometimes speaking to her for the first time only then. And the crowd, well, the crowd went back to their bread, their errands, their gossip. It was over. The ritual was not consistent across regions. In some areas, the process was brief and humorless, a man leading his wife through the street, finding a buyer, and making the exchange without fanfare. In others, it was elaborate. Costumes, mock announcements, staged arguments. There is even one record of a sale, being announced with a bugle and overseen by a self-appointed judge. It was farce. But it was also real. A woman still changed hands. In these more theatrical sales, the performance itself became part of the village culture. Children watched. Neighbors chuckled. And slowly, the act began to feel less like desperation and more like tradition. Like something their grandfathers had done, and their grandsons might do. The seriousness of the wife's life, her future, her fear, was buried beneath layers of absurdity. And yet, for the women, the performance did not soften the blow. If anything, it deepened it. To be sold is one thing. To be sold with jokes ringing in your ears, with strangers shouting your price, with your dignity turned into entertainment, that is another. The ritual hurt more because it asked you to smile while being erased. There are whispers of wives playing along, of women who laughed, who winked at the crowd, who made jokes themselves. These acts were not consent. They were survival. A way to hold on to some shred of pride in a moment that sought to strip it away. If you cannot escape the stage, perhaps you can steal a moment of your own performance. Sometimes, the ritual included drinks, shared between seller and buyer, between buyer and wife. A toast to the new arrangement. These rituals did not soften the event. They sealed it. They made it final in the eyes of the community. We drank to it, people would say later. And what is toasted becomes truth. In many cases, the ritual was repeated in almost identical fashion across years and regions. A pattern had formed. A tradition built atop cruelty. And once something becomes tradition, it becomes harder to question. That is the most dangerous thing about rituals. They can make even brutality feel like order. By the late 1800s, the ritual began to unravel. Crowds grew more uneasy. The laughter more strained. Reformers, writers, and pamphleteers began to attack the practice, calling it a stain upon the decency of the people. But even then, when the actual number of sales had dropped, the ritual lingered in memory. People remembered the axe, the laughter, the rope. They remembered not just what was done, but how it was done. That is what rituals do. They etch themselves into culture. And long after the final wife was sold in a muddy square, long after the last coin clinked into a buyer's hand, the ritual lived on, in stories, in fear, in jokes passed in pubs. It was no longer just something that happened. It was something that had happened again and again. A performance so well rehearsed, no one had noticed when it became real. If wife selling was a ritual, then drink was its incantation. The presence of alcohol in these scenes was not incidental, it was fundamental. Alehouses and taverns were not just where deals were made. They were where inhibitions dissolved, where decisions grew bolder, and where shame could be momentarily drowned in warm mugs. In fact, many sales began, or ended, with a drink, a toast to the transaction, a libation for forgetting. Taverns were the great social arenas of Victorian working-class life. Here, men gathered after shifts in mills or mines, pocketing a few pence for an evening's comfort. The talk was loud, the air dense with smoke and laughter, and beneath it all was the understanding that here, boundaries could bend. In the tavern, the husband might speak with a swagger he lacked at home. Encouraged by friends, he might mutter a bitter joke. "I'd sell her for a pint." Someone would laugh. Then someone would answer, "Go on then." It started as jest. But by the second round, it might no longer be a joke. Ale changed the tone of the transaction. It allowed men to perform confidence, to bury doubt. A husband uncertain about separating from his wife might be persuaded by the warmth in his belly and the nods of mates. "You'll be free, man," they might say. "A new start." Drink made it sound like escape. And in the blurry haze of drunken camaraderie, shame was hard to hold on to. Sales often took place near or within taverns. The courtyard became a makeshift auction floor. The barmaid might lean against the doorframe, arms folded, watching the rope exchange with a tired half-smile. Inside, a few coins clinked on the counter, and someone poured another round. The act did not pause life, it folded into it. The tavern provided cover, a place where laughter softened cruelty, where witnesses became just drinkers passing through. In some cases, the sale was sealed with ale. The buyer and seller would share a drink, raising mugs as though commemorating a trade of goods. "Done and drunk to," one man was quoted as saying after purchasing a woman. That phrase, recorded in a local paper, became its own shorthand for the scene. In the clink of mugs, a bond was made. It had no legal weight, but socially it was understood. The ale, like the handshake, was a ritual of conclusion. Fairs added a different flavor to the practice. Unlike taverns, which were familiar and enclosed, fairs were sprawling events, chaotic, colorful, noisy. There were vendors shouting, children chasing each other through stalls, music, animals, and crowds. In this chaos, wife sales took on a carnival air. The rope seemed less cruel, more performative. The laughter, more pronounced. The audience, larger. At fairs, the line between spectacle and transaction blurred. A man might step up on a cart and announce the sale with theatrical flair. Bidders might call out prices between bites of roasted chestnuts. Some buyers were strangers, passing through. Others were neighbors, long aware of the marriage's decay. The fair, with its swirl of sights and smells, gave the event a strange legitimacy. If it could happen here, among pigs and pies and puppets, then surely it was nothing serious. But for the women, it was just as real. The publicness did not soften the blow. If anything, the fair turned private despair into public theater. People who might have whispered behind hands in a tavern laughed openly at a fair. The rope around the waist became part of the costume. The wife, part of the act. And yet, when the crowd moved on to the next show, she was still sold. Drunkenness was sometimes used as a justification. He did not mean it, neighbors might say. He was deep in his cups. And in rare cases, men did try to take it back, to undo the sale after sobering up. But reversing a wife's sale was no easier than creating one. If the buyer refused to return her, and if the woman did not wish to go back, then the moment had passed. The ale had spoken. And undoing it would require more courage than most possessed in the morning light. For some, alcohol was a tool of courage. Selling a wife, even if agreed upon, carried emotional weight. A man might feel shame, loss, or hesitation. Drink quieted that. It blurred the memory even as it enabled the act. But for others, it was fuel for cruelty. There are accounts of men parading their wives drunk through the streets, shouting slurred insults, waving coins, daring others to buy. These were not clean separations. They were spectacles of degradation. In the lore of certain towns, tales of famous sales lived on for decades. The sale at the Red Bull Inn, people would say, or the fair sale of old Jack's daughter. These stories were retold in pubs, with each round of ale making the tale bolder, funnier, more grotesque. The tavern became both birthplace and graveyard of the memory, where it was conceived, and where it was kept alive. And so the cycle fed itself. The tavern was not just a location. It was a character in the story. It encouraged the sale, witnessed it, celebrated it, and then helped everyone forget, or pretend to. And in doing so, it gave the practice a strange kind of immortality. One that was soaked in ale, thick with smoke, and hard to separate from the community's heartbeat. Even as laws tightened and public opinion turned, the association between wife-selling and taverns remained. Reformers knew it. They targeted alehouses in their campaigns, believing that less drink might mean fewer sales. But they misunderstood something deeper. The ale did not create the cruelty. It simply exposed it. It allowed it to bloom without fear. To understand wife-selling fully, one must sit at that worn wooden table. One must hear the slosh of mugs and the murmur of gossip, the jokes whispered into the rim of a tankard. One must feel the heat of the room, the way the floor tilts just a little after the third pint, and how suddenly anything seems possible. Even the impossible. Even the irreversible. For decades, the practice of wife-selling played out across England's towns and villages with almost theatrical routine. It was loud, absurd, deeply public, yet somehow treated as invisible by the very systems meant to guard human dignity. But silence was never total. Amid the laughter and the coins, amid the crowds gathered in fairgrounds and muddy courtyards, there were those who flinched, who objected, who refused to accept the ritual as just another curious feature of English life. Their voices were not always loud, but they were sharp. And they came long before the official laws ever caught up. Clergymen were among the earliest to condemn the practice. In sermons delivered from wooden pulpits across the countryside, some priests railed against the moral decay they saw in wife sales. It is not trade, one preacher in Sussex declared in 1822. It is betrayal made spectacle. Yet their words rarely traveled far. Rural congregations were often small, and many farmers treated such criticisms as the out-of-touch mutterings of men who did not understand working life. Still, the message persisted. This was sin parading as custom. Writers, too, began to take aim. In regional newspapers and reformist pamphlets, the wife's sale was increasingly framed not as a quirky tradition, but as a symptom of broader injustice, of the way poor women in particular lived beneath the reach of law, beneath the concern of state. In 1835, a journalist wrote, "What man may sell another with a rope about her waist and call it freedom?" The piece was buried on page 6, but it struck a chord. Slowly, the language began to shift. By the mid-19th century, some local authorities had begun to denounce the practice publicly. In a few cases, constables intervened, not to arrest, but to disperse the crowd, to signal that the event was no longer acceptable. This did not end wife selling, but it drove it further underground, or at least out of the town center. Markets that once hosted such exchanges began to post notices forbidding them. Change was slow, but it had begun. Women's voices, too, began to stir. They had always existed, of course, in whispers, in letters, in the quiet defiance of those who refused to go quietly. But in the second half of the 1800s, their resistance became more visible. In journals, speeches, and rare but powerful articles, women questioned the very foundation of the ritual. "What is a woman?" one writer asked in 1871. "That she may be priced like wheat." In urban centers, where education and political awareness were more accessible, women's rights groups slowly formed. They fought for property rights, for custody after divorce, for voting, but among their concerns was also the treatment of women as goods. Wife selling became a symbol, a crude caricature of all the legal erasure women endured. And by naming it, by pointing to it in public discourse, they made it harder to ignore. Some of the most effective resistance came not from institutions, but from individuals who disrupted the ritual itself. A constable who stepped in to stop a sale. A neighbor who shouted down the men. A sister who took the wife's hand and walked her away before the rope was passed. These moments were small, scattered. They did not change the law, but they changed outcomes. And they proved that resistance did not need permission. There are accounts of women hiding their sisters before a planned sale, or warning potential buyers that the wife came with trouble. Some even threatened violence. These were acts of desperation, of love, and of understanding that the system offered no official help. So they helped each other. Literature played a quiet but growing role in shaping perception. Novelists began to include wife sales as signs of broken society, not as comedy, but as tragedy. In such stories, the act often led to ruin, shame, or moral awakening. Fiction allowed readers to feel the injustice in their bones, even if they had never seen it with their eyes. As printing became cheaper, reformers produced pamphlets that described wife selling in brutal, unflinching terms. These were distributed in working-class districts, calling for moral reform and public shame of those who carried out the act. "If your wife is your burden," one pamphlet read, "lay it before God, not the butcher's scale." Religious revivalists took up the cause as well. Traveling preachers in the Methodist and Quaker traditions spoke against the sale not just as sin, but as a stain on the nation's soul. They urged repentance. They offered counseling. In some towns, they helped women escape such fates, placing them in safe homes or offering legal aid, rare, but life-saving. Resistance also came from unexpected places. A few magistrates refused to honor wife sales, even informally. When disputes arose, as they often did after a sale, these men ruled that the exchange had no standing. Some even fined or jailed husbands for public disorder or cruelty. Though the law did not directly forbid the sales, creative interpretation became a tool of justice. The press grew more critical with each decade. What once had been reported with smirks began to be framed with outrage. Headlines changed. "Woman sold at market" became "Disgrace in Yorkshire Square." Language shaped perception, and perception shaped policy. By the 1880s, wife selling had largely faded. Not vanished entirely. A few outliers clung to the old ways, but the tide had turned. Where once it had been tolerated, even celebrated, it was now a cause for embarrassment. Reform had arrived not in a single thunderclap, but through 1,000 quiet voices, layered over time, until silence could no longer stand. And yet, the most profound protest may not have been the loudest. It was the woman who turned and walked away. The sister who blocked the door. The child who grew up and swore never to repeat the act. Resistance, in the end, was not always public. Often, it lived in the spaces between, in the small refusals that made large ones possible. When a custom fades, it does not always vanish. Sometimes it mutates. Sometimes it hides. And sometimes it lingers in the bones of a culture long after its flesh has decayed. So it was with the practice of wife-selling. By the end of the 19th century, the physical act, the rope, the crowd, the coin, had mostly disappeared. But its shape remained. In the minds of lawmakers, in the pages of books, and in the quiet corners of speech where people still whispered what used to be. The law never truly addressed wife-selling head-on. That fact, in itself, reveals much. For decades, the British legal system operated around it, above it, beneath it, but not through it. It was not legal, but it was tolerated. It was not recognized, but it was often reinforced by silence. When laws began to evolve, they did so by strengthening women's rights in marriage and divorce, rather than by banning the sale itself. It was as though no one wanted to look the practice in the eye, just ensure it would die a quiet death. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 marked a subtle turning point. It allowed ordinary people, not just the rich, to access divorce through civil courts. It gave women a narrow but real path out. And though it did not mention wife-selling, its existence made the practice feel increasingly obsolete. A woman did not need to be sold if she could now, legally, leave. Of course, many still lacked access or support. But the door, finally, was there. In literature, however, wife-selling refused to die quietly. It appeared in novels, memoirs, plays, sometimes as tragedy, sometimes as satire, but always as a symbol. Thomas Hardy, in his novel The Mayor of Casterbridge, opens with a chilling scene. A man drunkenly sells his wife and daughter at a country fair. The moment is grotesque, but believable. Hardy did not invent the scene. He borrowed from life. This is the strange thing about wife-selling. It was so theatrical, so implausible, and yet so real that it became irresistible for writers. It let them dramatize injustice, reveal character, shock their readers, and above all, it gave them a way to talk about marriage without preaching. A man selling his wife was not just cruel. He was exposing the flimsy structure beneath domestic life, a structure built on property, obedience, silence. In popular memory, the act shifted shape. It became legend, rumor, folklore. People told stories of, "The last wife sold in this town," or, "My grandfather saw it once and never forgot." Some tales were true. Others were embellished beyond recognition. But they all kept the memory alive. And where memory lives, so does meaning. Folklorists began to collect these stories. They found them in old parish records, in tavern songs, in letters scribbled between cousins. What they discovered was not just a pattern of behavior, but a cultural code, a way communities had managed shame and change, using ritual and storytelling to soften the blow of reality. Even long after the act ceased, people still spoke of it. Sometimes with laughter, sometimes with unease. In some villages, local sayings survived. "Do not let him tie the rope," or "She went for less than a pig." These were meant as jokes. But they were not innocent. They echoed a history of humiliation. They passed from mouth to mouth like warnings disguised as wit. Lawmakers began to refer to wife-selling in parliamentary debates, not as a threat, but as a moral failure of the past. Reformers used it as an example of what happened when women lacked legal standing. "Let us not return," one politician said in 1888, "to the days when a man might sell his wife in the square and face no consequence." That past, once common, had become a symbol of backwardness. Historians, too, began to document the phenomenon more seriously. Early 20th century scholars combed through county records, uncovering dozens of examples previously ignored. They catalogued them, footnoted them, and in doing so, gave the practice a second life, not as behavior, but as fact. Their books brought discomfort, but also clarity. The practice had happened. Repeatedly. Brazenly. And pretending otherwise would only prolong the damage. But perhaps the deepest echo was not in books or laws, but in family memory. A child who watched his mother disappear behind a stranger. A woman who remembered her own narrow escape. These memories passed through generations, shaping how people spoke of marriage, trust, betrayal. Not always consciously, but always there, just beneath the surface. Even as the 20th century marched forward, With its machines and wars and revolutions, the memory of wife selling lingered in certain places. A town might rename a square. A tavern might carry a plaque. A fairground might still whisper its stories. These were not celebrations. They were acknowledgments, small, quiet markers of what had been. In courtship rituals, the fear sometimes remained. A woman asking a suitor about his temper. A mother watching for signs. He would never do something like that, would he? Asked not as a real fear, but as a ghost question, born from old stories. The rope was gone. But the memory of its touch had not fully faded. There is a kind of cultural scar that forms when injustice is normalized for too long. Even after healing begins, the outline remains. The instinct to look over one's shoulder. The reflex to distrust. The nervous laughter when an old joke surfaces. These are not accidents. They are inheritances. Today, the average person in England may not know that wife selling ever happened. If they do, they might assume it was a myth, a medieval oddity. But it was not. It was real. It was recent. It happened in towns still standing, in squares still walked, in taverns still open for business. The fact that it feels impossible is part of the harm it caused. It made the unthinkable seem ordinary. And so it is remembered, not always clearly, not always correctly, but insistently. In shadow and echo. In line and footnote. In the way a people look back at themselves, puzzled by who they once were, and what they once allowed. Long after the last wife was sold in a public square, and long after the last rope slipped from one man's hand into another's, something remained. It lived not in laws or ledgers, but in breath, in the way women held their bodies in crowded rooms, in the way they lowered their eyes during arguments, in the way they whispered when they should have shouted. The sale may have ended, but the wound was inherited. We often speak of trauma as an individual event, something singular that scars the soul. But the trauma of wife selling was not personal. It was communal. It was cultural. It was something entire generations of women carried without always knowing its shape. Because when a society treats women as objects, as things to be priced, transferred, or discarded, that thinking does not vanish with the last transaction. It leaves a shadow. For many women, even those never sold or born too late for the practice, there was still the knowledge, whispered from mother to daughter, neighbor to friend, that such a thing had once been allowed. That a man could walk his wife into the open, tie her like livestock, and hand her to another. That this was not punished. That no one stepped in. That silence was stronger than justice. This knowledge had weight. It taught caution. It taught women not to trust too quickly, not to expect fairness, not to believe that love guaranteed respect. Even in households where kindness reigned, the stories echoed. A mother might tell her daughter, "Be careful whom you wed." But the warning was more than about heartbreak. It was about dignity. About not being turned into a transaction. The trauma filtered into language. Phrases like, "She married badly," or "He threw her away," were common in many towns, long after the sales had stopped. These were not idle sayings. They were verbal fossils, remnants of an era when a woman's value could be spoken aloud, reduced to coins, debated in public, and reassigned with a laugh. There were women who lived through the sale, who were sold, humiliated, removed from one life and forced into another. And many of them did not speak of it. Their silence was another kind of survival. They built new homes. Some remarried, some did not. But the event lived behind their eyes. It sat in the back room of memory, untouched but never truly forgotten. And sometimes, that silence passed down. A granddaughter might grow up knowing never to ask why her grandmother never spoke of the year she turned 21. A mother might change the subject when markets were mentioned. This was generational trauma, not loud, not visible, but persistent. A quiet reshaping of identity. Men, too, carried traces of the legacy, though differently. Sons watched their fathers handle disputes with entitlement. They heard stories of women, given away, and absorbed ideas about control, dominance, and the supposed natural order of things. Even if they never sold a wife, the idea that they could, once upon a time, had its effect. It gave them silence to stand on. In some families, the trauma surfaced as overprotection. A mother who refused to let her daughter court. A brother who distrusted all suitors. The wound had twisted into caution, and the caution into control. Pain became fear. Fear became custom. The practice also disrupted the way communities treated certain women, particularly those known to have been sold, or descended from those who were. Whispered reputations lingered. Even if the woman had no say in the sale, her name might carry its echo. She was not simply widowed or separated. She was the one who was bought. These labels outlived the event itself. What is most haunting is how normal the fear became. For many women, the idea of being disposable was not shocking. It was expected. Marriage was not a guarantee of safety. It was, at best, a negotiated risk. And while laws changed, hearts did not always keep pace. The cultural inheritance bled into art, poetry, and later film. Stories of women trapped, traded, or abandoned spoke not just to the sale, but to its lingering echo, the belief that a woman's life could be rearranged by others, that she existed at the whim of male decision. Even in the 20th century, echoes of this sale appeared in metaphor. People described divorces as trades, or joked that someone upgraded their wife. These were not harmless phrases. They drew their structure from an old, brutal truth that women had once been goods, and the language had not quite forgotten. Some women responded with rebellion. The suffragists, the reformers, the writers who demanded autonomy, they all inherited the silence of the women sold before them. And they answered it with voice, with protest, with the radical idea that no woman should ever fear being transferred like property, whether by law, by force, or by custom. And yet, perhaps the deepest legacy was the way the fear remained unnamed. No official monument marked it. No national apology was offered. It was buried under jokes and disbelief. And so, the trauma continued quietly, not as a single event, but as a long tremor through the bones of womanhood. To heal from such a past requires more than forgetting. It requires naming. It requires looking straight into the wound and saying, "Yes, this happened." Not to shame, but to understand. Not to accuse, but to remember. Because until that memory is fully held, it cannot be fully released. There comes a moment in every story, no matter how cruel, absurd, or forgotten, where the rope is finally set down. Not with a declaration. Not with the blare of trumpets, or a flourish of public shame, but simply, with stillness. That is how the tradition of wife-selling ended. Not with grand trials or sweeping reforms, but with a quiet disinterest. The crowd stopped showing up. The auction calls went unanswered. The man with the rope became a man out of time. The world had changed. Slowly. Painfully. Not in neat increments, but in jagged stumbles. The Industrial Revolution had upended village life. Women were moving to cities, working in factories, earning wages of their own. Education spread. Reform bills passed. And even though inequality remained deeply rooted, the cultural terrain had shifted just enough to make the sight of a woman tied by the waist feel like something from another planet, not just another century. It was not that society grew more gentle. Often it did not. But it grew more self-aware. More watched. The press, once a willing narrator of wife sales, began to flinch. Lawmakers who once chuckled now turned their faces. Reformers gained ground. Slowly, the rope frayed. Some historians have tried to pinpoint the last wife sale. They searched through records, dusty newspapers, faded court ledgers. A sale in 1887. Another rumored in 1901. One final transaction on the edge of rural Yorkshire, whispered about in 1926. But the truth is, there is no single ending. The tradition did not die. It decayed. Like all things built on silence, it collapsed inward. And yet, despite its slow vanishing, the echoes remained. The stories passed through families. Through old men muttering over pints. Through grandmothers who spoke with their eyes more than their mouths. through children who sensed there were things one did not ask. Wife selling did not vanish. It retreated into memory, into metaphor, into cultural scar tissue. Looking back now, it is difficult not to recoil. The very image, a woman with a rope around her waist, being sold like an animal, offends every modern sensibility. But that reaction is part of the healing. To be disturbed by the past is to recognize that it should not repeat. To shudder is not weakness. It is moral awareness. And yet, moral outrage is not enough. If we are to truly understand the world that allowed such things, we must also ask harder questions. Not just, how did they allow this? But, what customs do we tolerate today that future generations will find unthinkable? That is the true power of history, not to judge the past as alien, but to see it as a mirror, sometimes cracked, sometimes stained, but never useless. Wife selling may seem an absurd tradition now, barbaric, bizarre, almost comedic in its grotesque theater. But in its time, it was real, common, unremarkable to many. That should unsettle us. That should force us to ask, what made this possible? And how do we stop it from ever returning in spirit, even if never again in form? Because injustice rarely repeats itself in the same costume. The rope becomes a different symbol. The market becomes a digital platform. The auctioneer becomes a culture that devalues consent. The sale becomes a joke, a meme, a shrug. And so it is not enough to mock the past. We must remain alert to the present. Still, there is something sacred about naming a tradition as ended, as closed, as over. In this case, we can say it, wife selling is done. No one dares it now. No town square hosts it. No crowd gathers. The women of the past, dragged, humiliated, priced like cattle, are gone. But their stories remain. And those stories are no longer owned by the men who tied the ropes. They belong to us. To remember. To retell. To resist forgetting. The act of storytelling becomes its own form of rope cutting. Each time the tale is told, not as entertainment, but as truth, the thread unravels. We take back the narrative. We remove the shame from the woman and place it where it belongs, on the system, the culture, the silence. Even in its absurdity, wife selling teaches us something profound about power, about legality without morality, about how public opinion can create shadow laws. It shows us how deeply the human mind can justify what is convenient, even when it is cruel. It teaches us the cost of silence. But perhaps, above all, it teaches us that the past is never as far away as we think. It flickers in the phrases we use, in the hierarchies we inherit, in the jokes we do not question, in the eyes of those who still wonder if they can be discarded. And so we close the rope, not with a laugh, not with a final sale, but with a story, a voice, a long, slow remembering. We close it with the dignity the practice never had. We close it with sleep, not spectacle. With empathy, not entertainment. Let this chapter end not with outrage, but with reverence. For the women who stood in market squares. For the girls who listened from behind doorways. For the wives who walked away without a name. Let them rest now. The rope has been dropped. The crowd has gone home. The story is finally ours to hold, and to end gently. And so, the story ends not with a bang, but with quiet reflection. What began as a strange, almost unbelievable custom, men selling their wives with ropes and coins, has revealed something deeper. Not just about Victorian England, but about power, silence, and the human capacity to look away from cruelty when it becomes tradition. If this story unsettled you, let it. That discomfort is a reminder that the past was real, that dignity was once denied, and that history still lingers in the spaces we do not always think to look. Thank you for walking gently through this difficult past with me. And thank you for listening, not just with curiosity, but with care. Until next time, rest well, and remember, the stories we choose to remember shape the futures we choose to build. Good night.